Studies is delighted to welcome Jon PItt. Jon joins us from Tokyo, where he is a Japan Foundation doctoral fellow at Waseda University, completing a dissertation titled Becoming Botanical: Entanglements of Plant Life and Human Subjectivity in Modern Japan. We love this title. Where he's writing not only about literature, but also about film. Jon graduated with a BA in the Intensive Literature Program. This is an interesting BA. Intensive Literature Program, Japanese, at UC Santa Cruz, where he also studied intensive rakugo, oral performance. He treated me to a snippet yesterday. Very good at rakugo. Jon also holds an MA in Eastern Classics from St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And since 2014, he's been a PhD student in East Asian languages and cultures at UC Berkeley. We're very happy to have you with us today and hear more about your work.
All right, well, I would like to begin by thanking the search committee, as well as the faculty and staff of the East Asian Studies Department here at UC Irvine, and in particular Michelle Hu, who was a great help in arranging my travel here today. So my talk today is drawn from my current research project, which, as Mimi explained, is titled Becoming Botanical: Entanglements of Plant Life and Human Subjectivity in Modern Japan. So with this project, I argue that the natural world of vegetation has offered a means for Japanese writers and filmmakers to work through the fragmentation of subjectivity, occasioned by turbulent histories from the 1930s to the present. So focusing both on the radical alterity of vegetation, as well as the similarities shared between humans and plants, the texts which form the core of my research demonstrate the ontologically ambiguous position of vegetation. Plants are inanimate, yet largely believed to be immobile. Sorry, they're animate, yet largely believed to be immobile. Now, despite this immobility, they are the frequent subjects of moving image media, such as film. And they are mundane and ubiquitous, yet they are also at times sacred. They are speechless, yet made to speak in literature in Japan since its earliest poetry. So the writers and filmmakers I discuss in this project embrace the alterity of plant life and question its implications in regards to humans. Informed by the plasticity of vegetal life, so-called phenotypic plasticity, in which organisms change in response to their environment, the authors and film directors I discuss posit a similar form of plasticity available to humans and human subjectivity. Informed by the work of Catherine Malibu and David W. Bates, I read the protagonists of the text that I examine as open, living systems that slowly but persistently adapt to the slow fabric of catastrophe unfolding around them. The catastrophe I locate in these texts is not, however, spectacular. Instead, I follow Christopher Dole in questioning what it means to rethink catastrophe beyond the immediacy of shock, and rather as, quote, both a backdrop to and a condition for the intimate terrain of everyday lives, end quote. In opening up the conditions for adaptation, plasticity recontextualizes what it means to be human, as it permits ongoing change that destabilizes firm boundaries that separate humans from other forms of life, such as non-human animals and plants. The aim of my research is to examine how texts that are attuned to the environment, but not obviously environmentalist in orientation, raise many of the same questions as those that focus directly on ecological degradation. These questions include how humans and the natural world are intertwined, and how such intertwining impacts configurations of agency and subjectivity. I'm interested in the writers and filmmakers in Japan that have long been working through the relationship between humans and the botanical in order to examine their works as specific responses to discrete historical moments, and to explore how these responses can be conjugated within a larger media environment. For many of the writers and filmmakers I take up in my research, including the pre-war writer and early film critic Osaki Midori, biologist Imanishi Kinji, post-war novelist and critic Hanya Yutaka, and contemporary filmmaker Kawase Naomi, close engagements with plant life lead to notions of a new form of subjectivity that I align with Deleuze and Guattari's concept of becoming. As outlined in their 1,000 Plateaus, of becoming creates something wholly new through an alliance of distinct parties. For example, human and animal, animal and plant, or, as is the case for the writers I discuss, human and plant. For this group of writers and filmmakers, the new form of subjectivity that I call a botanical becoming was nearly utopian. It opened up subjectivity beyond the confines of human temporality and into the longue durée of plant life and evolutionary deep time. For a different group of writers, however, botanical becomings were markedly dystopian. In their works, an affinity towards plant life leads to dehumanization, a negative post-humanism occasioned by the botanical world. Writers as diverse as pre-war modernist Sato Haruo and contemporary science fiction writer Tsuya Taka turned to plants not to move beyond the violence of their respective historical moments, but rather to bring such violence to light. Through the enduring allegorical trope in which a human undergoes a metamorphosis into a plant, the text written by this group of writers suggests there is, in fact, no means to transcend one's historical moment. My talk today focuses on one such story of horrific metamorphosis into a plant. Post-war novelist and playwright Abe Kobo's Dendrococcalia. First published in 1949 and revised and republished in 1952, this novella uses the trope of metamorphosis, which was a recurring staple of Abe's oeuvre, to explore the lingering violence of wartime memory. In Dendrococcalia, Abe resists the post-war tendency towards disavowal of colonial violence and confronts the history of Japanese colonialism through the motif of becoming botanical. The story makes clear the link between Japan's colonial history and the botanical world, as its protagonist becomes a Dendrococcalia crepidifolium, a tree native only to Hahajima of the Bonin or Ogasawara Islands, which lay about 1,000 kilometers south of Tokyo. Japan's colonial project was deeply tied to the natural world, through the extraction of natural resources, as Japan's history of colonial forestry throughout Asia demonstrates. Yet there exists a connection between colonialism and the botanical world on a figurative level as well. As Christy Wampel demonstrates, post-colonial identity politics often invoke botanical metaphors, such as uprooting, transplanting, and vegetal invasion. This metaphor is present at the level of the Japanese language. As the Japanese word for colonization, shokumin is a translation of the Dutch volkplanting, or people planting. Now, Japan holds a long and complex colonial history with the Bonin Islands, stretching back to the early modern Edo period and continuing to the present day. After serving as a base for military operations during the Second World War, the islands fell under the control of the American military in 1968, until 1968, I'm sorry. So after the Second World War until 1968, at which point the islands were officially reverted back to Japanese ownership. In Dendrococcalia, the head of a botanical garden that serves as the story's antagonist remarks on the rarity of coming across the Dendrococcalia in the Naichi, a term meaning interior land and thus the metropole of the Japanese mainland, as opposed to the Gaichi, meaning exterior land and thus the overseas territories of Japan's colonies. Now, Abe uses this interior-exterior dichotomy in multiple registers throughout Dendrococcalia. In addition to exploring the tension between the colonial markers of internal Naichi and external Gaichi, the story also makes legible a dichotomy between the protagonist's interior subjectivity and the exterior world. So Abe builds a bridge between the Naichi-Gaichi divide and the subjective interiority-exteriority divide through a botanical becoming. In the process, he works to destabilize the boundaries between these supposed binaries. As the protagonist, named Common, becomes a tree uprooted from its native land, firm distinctions between the Naichi and Gaichi begin to dissolve. During metamorphosis, Common's face dislodges and turns backwards, effectively gazing inward. As Common is forced to face his own subjective interiority, he must also reckon with the repressed wartime memory harbored within. As Michael Martyr writes, quote, "Plants provide us with a very peculiar shelter where the traditional distinction between interiority and exteriority no longer applies," end quote. For Kamen, however, this peculiar shelter provides no safety. Instead, he is confronted with the reality of violence. Dendrococcalia engages with the interior-exterior dichotomy at yet another register as well. The story makes numerous references to Russian botanist Clement Timiryazev, whose influential treatise on plant physiology, The Life of the Plant, which was originally published in 1878 and translated into Japanese as Shokubutsu no Seikatsu in 1934. This text participated in a significant shift in the study of plant life. In his discussion of plants within the Foucauldian concept of biopower, Jeffrey T. Nealon outlines a systemic shift in the 19th century that Foucault recognized as a change from the study of natural science to that of biology. So this shift in the 19th century entailed, according to Foucault, quote, a mutation of the dominant epistemic procedures from a representational discourse that maps external similitude and resemblance to the emergence of a speculative discourse that takes as its object hidden internal processes. End quote. So Timiryazev's work focuses on the internal processes of plants, exposing the previously hidden internal world of vegetal life. Informed by this movement inwards, Dendrococcalia in turn turns to the newly exposed world of plants in order to expose the increasingly hidden recent memory of Japan's colonial project. Abe Kobo was intimately familiar with colonial space. Born in Tokyo and raised in colonial Manchuria, Abe relocated to the Japanese mainland in 1946. During his prolific career as a writer, he wrote several stories set in the colonial space of the Gaichi, such as his 1948 debut novel, Owarishimichi no Shirube ni, for the signpost at the end of the road, his 1952 short story, Ueta Hifu, The Starving Skin, as well as 1957's Kemono Tachi wa Kokyo o Mezasu, Beasts Head for Home. Dendrococcalia, however, grapples with Japan's colonial project from within the internal Naichi of the Japanese mainland. And just as Abe's concern with coloniality makes scattered appearances throughout his oeuvre, so too does his interest in vegetal life. While his best-known work, 1962's Suna no Onna, Woman of the Dunes, explores the relationship between the material world and human subjectivity in a sand-filled atmosphere devoid of plant life, several other works take up botanical life in order to question the status of the human subject. His 1957 short story, Namari no Tamago, Lead Egg, portrays a speculative future in which humans have become more plant-like, with green skin and extremely long lifespans. His 1975 play, Midori Iro no Stockingu, Green Stockings, features an experiment in which a human is turned into an herbivore and thus comes to subsist only on vegetation. Abe would even revisit plant metamorphosis late in his career, with 1991's Kangaroo Noto, Kangaroo Notebook, in which the protagonist begins to sprout radishes through his skin. Now, in a 1952 essay written about the advent of avant-garde ikebana, flower arranging, Abe paraphrases Jean-Paul Sartre's comments on Swiss sculptor Alberto Giacometti, saying, quote, "Plants are free, but the human body is not free. To speak of the relationship between the model and the artwork, plants are unpredictable, guzen, and the human body is a foregone conclusion, hitsuzen." End quote. Now, in Dendrococcalia, Abe likewise found a certain freedom in taking plants as a model to discuss colonial memory. The fantastic qualities of plant metamorphosis likely helped the story navigate the occupation censorship that was still a lingering reality for Japanese writers in 1949. Critics such as Hanya Yutaka have positioned Dendrococcalia as a transitional text for Abe. They argue the story marks a change from Abe's existential and formally experimental early work, like Owarishimichi, his first novel, to the more absurdist and formally standardized work found in his 1951 novella, Kabe S. Karman Shi no Hanzai, The Wall, the Crime of S. Karma. In fact, the period between the publications of the two versions of the story was likewise a transitional time for Abe. In 1950, he would join the Communist Party, and in 1951, he would win the coveted Akutagawa Prize for Literature. Now, there are differences between the two versions of Dendrococcalia. The 1949 version is longer and features an opening section of direct address to the reader that is excised in the 1952 version. The identity of the narrating voice is also far less stable in the earlier version, and there was a greater sense of ambiguity over the roles certain characters play in the narrative. The shorter 1952 version is more cohesive and eliminates some of these ambiguities. The general outline of the plot, however, remains the same between the 1949 and 1952 versions. My talk today draws primarily from the 1952 version. In both versions, the protagonist, Common, suddenly feels as if he is turning into a plant one day, while walking down the street and absentmindedly kicking a stone. He feels the strong pull of gravity, and suddenly everything becomes dark. Within the darkness, however, he sees his own face, quote, as if reflected in a train window, end quote. The feeling is momentary and passes without incident. A year goes by without Common experiencing a plant metamorphosis, until one day he receives a mysterious letter from someone identified only as K. The letter asks Common to come to a cafe the following day. Common goes, believing the letter to be from a now forgotten ex-girlfriend. As Common waits for K at the cafe, his senses become strangely heightened. Now, throughout Dendrococcalia, Abe engages in a kind of speculative phenomenological account of the experience of becoming botanical. In the process, he demonstrates a rather acute understanding of plant life. While the trope of plant metamorphosis is fantastic, Abe's experiential account of Common's metamorphosis aligns with scientific theories of plant life. For example, as Common inspects the interior of the cafe and the exterior world outside the window, the narrator remarks how Common's eyes have become, quote, like magnifying glasses, end quote. Now, as contemporary plant neurobiologist Stefano Mancuso has demonstrated, theories of plant vision have circulated in scientific communities at least since 1905, when Austrian botanist Gottlieb Aberland proposed the cells of a plant's epidermal layer act like convex lenses, giving plants a kind of visual capacity. Francis Darwin, son of Charles, became a proponent of this theory and wrote of it extensively. In 1908, British botanist Harold Wager actually published photographs produced using the epidermal cells of various plants. Common sensitivity to light and uncomfortable visual experience seems to capture some of the peculiarities of this proposed plant vision. Now, as Common struggles with his newly altered vision, an unknown man enters the cafe. This man stares at Common, at which point Common's neck unhinges. His head falls forward, his eyes suddenly meeting his chest. Common realizes he is once again becoming a plant. And as he struggles to regain composure, he notices a banner hanging on a side outside promoting Ryokashukan, or Greening Week. Now, this is a reference to a program that was resumed in 1947, in which Japanese citizens participated in rehabilitating the war-torn natural environment by planting trees. Beginning with its revival in 1947, Greening Week featured an official ceremony conducted by the Crown Prince. The slogan for the 1947 campaign was, quote, "Repair the ruined land of our country with peaceful green. Areta kokudo wo heiwa na midori de." Now, this type of rhetoric that linked peace and rehabilitation to plant life persisted as Greening Week continued into the post-war era. The stated objective of the 1950 campaign was, quote, "to extend tree planting Greening Week to the whole country in order to rehabilitate a peaceful Japan that is beautifully green and full of culture," end quote. For Abe, Greening Week represented a kind of greenwashing of historical truth. Its rhetoric of rehabilitation via peaceful green denied the ugly realities of the Japanese post-war. Upon seeing the banner for Greening Week, Common's body begins to dissolve, as his internal organs, quote, "squeeze out to the exterior of his body," end quote. And here again, Abe shows a keen understanding of plant life. As Mancuso explains, quote, plants distribute over their entire body the function that animals concentrate in specific organs. Decentralization is the key. Plants breathe with their whole body. They see with their whole body and feel with their whole body, end quote. Now, Common likewise becomes decentralized through plant metamorphosis. His hands become leaves, he loses a sense of time, and he regains consciousness and realizes 3 hours have passed. Leaving the cafe, he enters the crowds on the street and hears the following announcement somewhere off in the distance. Quote, "It is currently greening week. To all passers-by, let us love trees. Plants provide harmony for our hearts that are in ruins. Plants make our neighborhoods clean and beautiful." End quote. Upon hearing this, Common comes upon destroyed buildings, yakeato, the literal ruins of the city left over from war, and the very material ruins Greening Week looks to move beyond. Among the remains of war, Common once again commences becoming botanical. The loss of distinction between interior and exterior is made even more explicit during this transformation among the yakeato ruins. Quote, "He had a sense that this time he was clearly becoming a plant. Or rather, he felt the whole of the exterior world was becoming himself, and that tube-like part that had been himself up to this point, but was no longer himself, was becoming a plant. Yet he felt no need to resist. Wasn't it just as the advertisement had said? Our hearts that are in ruins. ... End quote. Now this moment holds potential for transcendence. Common suddenly embraces plant metamorphosis as his subjectivity dissolves into the exterior world. It is at this point of the narrative that we find the promise of plasticity. Greening Week posits a utopian scenario in which the ravaged internal spirits of a nation are healed by repairing the ruined external world with peaceful green. As mentioned earlier, writers in the pre-war era, such as Osaki Midori, attempted to construct a new form of subjectivity in alliance with the botanical world in order to move beyond the violence of colonial modernity. Now here, at this moment in the narrative, Abe seems to be doing the same thing in the post-war. Common's embrace of the Greening Week rhetoric portrays Dendrococalia's botanical becoming as similarly utopian, as it looks toward vegetal plasticity in order to forge a new kind of subjectivity. This moment doesn't last for long, however. A voice rings out in surprise, identifying and interpolating Common for the first time as a Dendrococalia. A man that we will come to recognize as the head of the botanical garden approaches the transformed Common and pulls out a naval knife. The man remarks, quote, "How rare to be able to collect a Dendrococalia in the Japanese mainland." Naichi, end quote. So standing among the bombed out remains of the city with a military knife in hand, the botanical garden employee prevents Common's attempts at moving beyond the historical realities of post-war Japan. The Dendrococalia plant is not a peaceful greening. It is a plant endemic to the Bonin Islands, and thus a reminder of Japan's external gaichi. It is a physical reality bearing witness to the lands exterior to the Japanese mainland that now, in the immediate post-war, either regained sovereignty, such as Korea, or found themselves in a state of political limbo at the hands of the US occupation, such as the Ryukyu or Okinawan Islands and the Bonin Islands as well. So the employee's declaration of the rarity of a Dendrococalia being in the Naichi mainland marks a turning point in the narrative. The remainder of the story finds Common trying to evade and ultimately kill the employee with the military knife, no less. While the employee likewise attempts to convince Common to come live within the space of the botanical garden. He assures Common he will be safe there, as the garden receives, quote, government protection. Ultimately, Common is placed alongside many other humans turned plants, all of whom are adorned with national flags. The story ends with the head of the garden laughing and pinning a name card on the Dendrococalia that had once been Common. Now, through the figure of the Dendrococalia plant and the government-protected botanical garden, Abe presents an allegorical diagnosis of Japan's negotiation of wartime memory. Within this tale of plant metamorphosis is a critique of the greening or beautification of such memory. As numerous historians and cultural critics such as Sebastian Conrad and Karatani Kojin have discussed, Japanese rhetoric surrounding wartime violence in the colonial Gaichi has been, and continues to be, shrouded in disavowal. Within Abe's allegorical figuration, governmental authority safely and securely tends to such living memories, keeping them manicured and carefully categorized. Dendra Kakalia asks post-war Japanese readers to resist the post-war ideology of disavowal and confront one's own place as a subject of a formerly imperialist regime engaged in the erasure of colonial violence. Now, for the influential literary critic Haneda Kiyoteru, Dendra Kakalia marked a new attitude toward the representation of plant life in literature. In a 1973 essay titled Bronze wa Osuki, Do You Like Brahms?, Haneda argues that Abe moves beyond the trope of plant metamorphosis found in literary romanticism. Haneda draws a line between Abe's depiction of plant life in Dendra Kakalia to Osaki Midori's treatment of moss in her 1932 novella Dainana Kankai Ho Ho, Wandering in the Realm of the Seventh Sense. For Haneda, these works featured, quote, plants of the 20th century, end quote. Now, if Abe found a certain freedom in taking the botanical world as a model, as I discussed earlier, what was it in particular that drew him to the Dendra Kakalia? Right? The plant goes actually by the Japanese name Wadan no Ki in the Japanese, but Abe doesn't use this name anywhere in the story and refers to it only by its Latin name within Linnaean taxonomy. The use of the plant's Latin name adds a scientific air to the narrative and speaks to the milieu in which the plant was taken up as a scientific object of study. In 1936, the Botanical Society of Japan published a series of articles that ran throughout several issues of their Shokubutsugaku Zashi that characterized the flora of the Bonin Islands. The articles were published entirely in Latin, save for a few passages in English. I realize it's a little blurry there and hard to read, but you can get a sense from the title that it is in Latin. The Dendra Kakalia is featured in the 5th installment of this series. Now, the Dendra Kakalia plant stands about 3 meters in height, with a trunk reaching up to 5 to 6 centimeters in diameter. It is a member of the Asteraceae family of flowering plants, which includes asters, daisies, sunflowers, and chrysanthemums. Within this large family of flowering plants, the Dendra Kakalia is unique. Endemic to the island of Hajima, it grows only around Shibusayama, the mountain which stands as the highest point of the island. Now, the Bonin Islands are a rich source of endemic species, a fact that has continued to draw the attention of biologists. Just as the many endemic species of the Galapagos helped Charles Darwin develop his theory of evolution, so too have the endemic flora of the Bonin Islands contributed to continuing scientific research. The unique ecosystems of the islands have earned them the status of UNESCO World Heritage Site, and scholarly interest continues to grow as endemic species on the islands face increasing threats from non-native species and climate change. Now, endemic species such as the Dendra Kakalia are something of a puzzle. According to Ito Motomi, who is a researcher of plant evolution and biodiversity at Tokyo University, the origins of the Dendra Kakalia are mysterious. He writes, quote, "From what kind of ancestors did the Dendra Kakalia evolve? In truth, we still cannot answer this question. We do not find a plant that closely resembles the Dendra Kakalia within the Asteraceae family," end quote. Now, for the Bonin Islands, the issue of unclear ancestry extends beyond the botanical realm. By the time Japan officially claimed the islands as colonial property in 1876, they had already been a contested site for decades. Both Britain and Japan believed the islands to be rightfully theirs, and Matthew Perry famously made a visit to the islands a month prior to landing on the Japanese mainland. This contested history led to a diverse population of human inhabitants on the island. Records of the first Bonin Islanders to enter the Japanese family registration system, the Jinshin Koseki, which was established by the Meiji government in the 1870s, demonstrates this reality. Of the initial 5 islanders that registered, 1 was British, 1 was Spanish, and 3 were Pacific Islanders. By 1882, the entire population of the islands was entered into the family registry, making the Bonin Islanders legal subjects of Japan. As David Chapman explains, the islands were unique among Japan's colonial properties in this regard. He writes, quote, "Because the Ogasawara Islands were part of the emerging nation earlier than colonies such as the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan, the foreign inhabitants were placed in the same registry as other Japanese, much like the populations of the Ryukyu Islands. In contrast, the colonial territories of Korea and Taiwan had special colonial registers, gaichi koseki, that were administered by colonial offices and abolished after the war." End quote. Thus, according to family registries, the inhabitants of the Bonin Islands belonged not to the colonial space of the gaichi, but rather to the Naichi metropole, even if they had been born in Britain or Spain. It's worth noting that Abe's own family registry was situated in Hokkaido, another colonial acquisition that does not map neatly onto the Naichi-Gaichi divide. Now, the ambiguity over the status of the Bonin Islanders took on a potentially violent nature in 1944, as the Japanese government ordered the forced evacuation of the islands. As close to 7,000 residents returned to the Naichi mainland that had not been their home, they were often greeted with suspicion and threats of violence. As Chapman further recounts, quote, "With some members of this group having blonde hair and blue or green eyes, the Bonin Islanders were often questioned about their origin, and most time their interrogators were unaware of the existence of the Ogasawara Islands, much less the small community of descendants of original foreign settlers." End quote. When Japan surrendered to the United States the following year, the status of the islanders was further complicated. As the Bonin Islands fell under the control of the US military, the islanders became wards of the United States, while maintaining, on paper at least, Japanese citizenship. When islanders were allowed to return to their former home in 1946, they found it largely in ruins. US bombing raids had leveled much of the island of Chichijima, decimating buildings as well as plant life. Eventually, the islands were returned to Japanese sovereignty in 1968 and remain official Japanese territory to this day. Now, this complex history forms the background to Abe's Dendrocacalia. The tale of an endemic species uprooted from the islands and pursued in the Naichi echoes the experience of the Bonin Islanders, who were similarly uprooted into the potentially dangerous space of the Naichi. The narrative aligns the unsettled demarcation of Kamen's interiority and the exterior world with the unsettled push and pull between interior and exterior that formed this colonial history, in which the islanders held Naichi legal status, while at times being visibly marked as either exterior colonial subjects or even more dangerously, foreign enemies. It is the figure of the Dendrocacalia plant and Abe's diegetic inclusion of Clement Timirisev's The Life of the Plant that allows for this alignment. So in Dendrocacalia, Abe positions the Dendrocacalia plant at the intersection of competing regimes of knowledge. After Kamen's encounter in the bombed-out ruins with the head of the botanical garden, he visits the library to research plant metamorphosis. There, he begins reading Dante's Divine Comedy and Greek mythology, although he recognizes this is an unscientific way to begin searching for an explanation for something that is actually occurring in his body. Now, through his reading of Dante and Greek mythology, Kamen develops a folkloric/religious explanation for his plant metamorphosis. Within the Divine Comedy, the middle circle of the seventh layer of hell is populated by those guilty of the sin of suicide, whereupon they are turned into trees and become food for the mythical half-human, half-bird harpies. Kamen embraces this unscientific explanation and concludes, quote, "Without knowing it, I guess I must have already committed suicide." End quote. With this, Kamen decides he must kill the head of the botanical garden. When they meet again, Kamen explains how he has been reading Dante and Greek mythology and accuses the accuses the employee of being a harpy. The employee condemns mythology and offers a scientific explanation in its place. He says, quote, "Isn't Greek mythology a little unscientific, Mr. Dendrocacalia? It does more harm than good. Do you want to hear something more interesting? Have you read Timiryassev's The Life of the Plant? This is what it says. There is no qualitative difference between plants and animals. There is only a quantitative difference. In other words, plants and animals are scientifically the same." End quote. Now, Clement Timiryasev was a highly influential botanist in his native Russia. He was a contemporary of Charles Darwin and an adamant supporter of Darwin's theory of evolution. Timiryasev even wrote an account of visiting Darwin in England when Darwin was working with his son Francis on their study of the botanical world, which was entitled The Power of Movement in Plants. Now, while Darwin's text influenced plant biology in Europe and the United States, it would not be translated into Japanese until 1987. Timirassev's The Life of the Plant, on the other hand, was initially translated into Japanese in 1934 and went through 3 printings in the following 13 years. In his preface to the 1947 edition, translator Ishii Tomoyuki writes, quote, "Popular books and general introductions devoted to the study of plants are extremely common both abroad and in Japan. However, I do not know whether another general introduction exists that is as unique and as excellent as Timirassev's The Life of the Plant." Now, what Ishii finds particularly rare in The Life of the Plant is Timirassev's scientific engagement with a mysterious energy within plants that Ishii aligns with vitalism. The Life of the Plant, by its very title, grants a notion of life to the botanical realm. As the antagonist of Dendrocacalia claims, Timirassev's work looks to diminish the ontological distance between plants and animals. The head of the Botanical Gardens claim that, quote, "there is no qualitative difference between animals and plants," end quote. This can indeed be found in the 9th chapter of The Life of the Plant. Drawing from scientific research, Timirassev investigates whether plants in fact exhibit characteristics that have previously been ascribed only to animals. These characteristics include movement, nutrition, respiration, stimulation, and finally, consciousness. Now, although he admits the question of consciousness comes up against the limits of experimental inquiry and is thus scientifically unknowable, in each other case, he demonstrates that plants do in fact possess the same characteristics and internal processes as animals. Having reached this conclusion, Timirassev writes, quote, "It follows that the difference between plants and animals is not qualitative, but only quantitative. The same processes take place in both kingdoms, but some of them predominate in the one and some in the other." End quote. So for Timirassev, plants live lives in very much the same way as animals. The Life of the Plant participates in a metamorphosis of scientific epistemology. The uniqueness of Timirassev's research breaks with the history of natural science, as Foucault characterizes it in The Order of Things. As I discussed earlier, Foucault tracks the epistemic shift in the move away from natural science into the study of biology in the 19th century. According to Foucault, quote, "The naturalist is a man concerned with the structure of the visible world and its denomination according to characters, not with life." End quote. So a movement inwards from the exterior world of the visible into the interior world of life marked a new era of science. The exposure of a concept of life in living beings came to inform biological study. Foucault further argues, quote, "It is understandable how the notion of life could become indispensable to the ordering of natural beings. It was essential to be able to apprehend in the depths of the body the relations that link superficial organs to those whose existence and hidden forms perform the essential functions." End quote. Foucault grants a realm of interior depth and life to plants as well. Timirassev's The Life of the Plant is representative of this sea change in scientific knowledge. It grants the botanical world a notion of life. It exposes the previously hidden internal forces of plants, granting them movement and potentially consciousness. Having moved beyond the objective realm of the visible, Timiryasev asks, quote, "What is the limit beyond which an object becomes a subject?" End quote. Common's botanical becoming in Dendrocacalia posits a similar question. Confronted with the hidden, internally repressed memories of colonial violence, the narrative questions how one becomes a subject of one's own history rather than an object within it. It grapples with the possibility of such subjectivity within the context of a colonial history continuing into the Japanese post-war period. Now, while the head of the botanical garden praises Timiryasev and calls plants, quote, "the new gods" and "the hope of the present," the employee fundamentally misunderstands the implications of the interior space Timiryasev's research opens up. He tells Common, quote, "A plant is purity, jinsui, itself." That word so full of pathos that has been expunged from everyday usage, end quote. So for the head of the botanical garden, plant metamorphosis, like Greening Week, is a means of moving forward. It covers the ugly, messy, devastated remains of colonial subjectivity with a pure, peaceful green. In the process, colonial memory is objectified, locked away in a hothouse that is kept under key by the government. Unlike Timiryasev's plants, the botanical becomings in the garden are deprived of life. They exist in the limbo of the visible, suspended in animation and full of hidden truths. And so while the antagonist of Dendrocacalia misunderstands the potential for revelation inherent in the life of the plant, it seems clear that Abe himself was well aware of the implications of Timiryasev's work. Abe took Timiryasev's insight into the hidden internal world of plants as the basis for his own exploration of a colonial legacy slipping into the hidden world of disavowal. He rejected the potential for transcendence offered in the process of metamorphosis, a potential embraced by other writers, by the National Greening Promotion Committee, and, diegetically, by the head of the botanical garden. Instead, Abe mobilized the movement inward occasioned through plant metamorphosis in order to stay with the trouble, to borrow a phrase from Donna Haraway. In The Life of the Plant, Timiryasev calls the act of metamorphosis, quote, "the expression in space of what has taken place in time," end quote. Abe's plant metamorphosis in Dendrocacalia expresses, in the space of a relatively few number of pages, the horror of the long colonial history of the Bonin Islands. Abe's botanical becoming opens space for the reflection on this history and warns of the dangers of the beautification of ugly truths. As Hanada Kiyoteru claimed, the plants of Dendrocacalia are plants of the 20th century. They are full of violent memories of Japanese colonialism waiting to be brought to light. Applying an eco-critical lens to the study of modern Japanese literature and media sheds light on such histories. In the process, it also helps us rethink Japanese literature and media themselves by moving away from dominant critical paradigms that inevitably veer toward the anthropocentric. By decentering the human in our critical approach, we stand to learn not only about the non-human, be they animals or plant, but we can also rethink what we mean by human in the first place. If we accept that the non-human natural world, that world that is so often mistakenly believed to be separate from ours, if we accept that it is in fact alive and inseparable from how we see ourselves as human subjects, then we can look to it as a potential model for change, just as the writers and filmmakers I examine in my research have done. In an age of encroaching climate crisis, we need to rethink ourselves as human subjects one way or another, either by embracing a plasticity that leads to a more ecological stewardship of the planet, or a plasticity that leads to a resilience in the face of ecological degradation. According to Catherine Malibu, quote, "Acknowledgement of the role of destructive plasticity allows us to radicalize the deconstruction of subjectivity, to stamp it anew. This recognition reveals that a power of annihilation hides in the very constitution of identity," end quote. By looking toward the ways in which writers and filmmakers in modern Japan found both destructive and generative qualities inherent in the plasticity of human subjectivity, perhaps we too can hope to forge a new identity that takes account of our enmeshment in the natural world. Perhaps then we can become humans of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Wow, that was a great talk. So it's 10 of 12, and we have until 12:30 for this session.
Okay.
So if you don't mind taking your own questions.
Sure, yeah.
Just see how things evolve as people chime in with their
Great.
comments and remarks.
Yes.
So my name is Ann Walpole, and I'm an historian once upon a time. So I'm not, so accustomed to literary theory. But what I found really interesting in your discussion of Abe Kobo's work and the way he's drawing on the Russian life of plants,
Right.
is that it seems to be taking Abe away from any kind of indigenous interpretation of the life of plants. And I'm thinking, of course, in the very commonly known as kami. You see these trees with ropes and white streamers around them, and that's celebrating whatever it is that animates that tree,
Right.
or a mountain, or a rock, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Is he completely divorced from this indigenous tradition and looking only to Russia for his ideas about the interior life of plants?
Yeah, that's a great question. Abe, he's an interesting figure. His relationship to Japan and indigenous cultures in Japan has always been something of a point of conversation. He's one of these figures that's definitely within the Japanese literary canon, but is also somehow seen as outside of it. He draws a lot from European literature, as all Japanese modern writers actually do, but he's sort of the one that a lot of people say, well, there's something not quite Japanese enough about it. Now, part of that might be that, he was raised in Manchuria, writes about that quite a bit. But this question of kami, right, of kind of indigenous Shinto, or what we call Shinto cosmology of plants, in this story is completely absent. The only point that it kind of makes, a little bit of its head pokes up is in that line in which the head of the botanical garden says, plants are purity itself, right, Junsi, like this question of purity, especially at this point in the post-war moment, right, this is why he says, this has been expunged from everyday usage, right, this question of purity, yeah.
It's certainly back now.
Sure, sure. But yeah, that kind of rhetoric, right, of purity, the way in which Shinto ideology certainly fueled the wartime efforts, is very, it's only in that one moment. The project that I'm working on, more broadly, certainly looks at that, and in places that you might not expect to find it. So I mentioned Hanya Yutaka, who wrote this massive life's work called Shide, right, Dead Spirits, which is kind of the subject of one of the chapters that I'm working on. And he and Abe were quite close and communicated with each other. The actual first mention of Dendrococcalia is in a letter that Abe sent to Hanya. He says, I'm writing this really strange story about a man turning into a plant. But that novel, Shide, has, there's no direct reference to Shinto, kami, anything like that. But there's an aura about it, particularly in the way that it treats forests and the relationship between the dead and forests, spirits, that is very informed, at least I'm arguing, by this kind of indigenous, knowledge about, epistemology, cosmology.
So Abe is sort of a moment in the post-war period where there's a real rejection of anything that smacks of kokutai or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah. This is the time where, especially for people within the literary world, they're publishing a lot of these stories in journals that are also publishing basically accusations. Trying to figure out, okay, well, which of us was accountable? Right? Which of us participated in the war effort? Who's dirty? Who's clean? Right? And so, language is very, very charged, at this moment, and anything that veers, I think, too close to any kind of Shinto ideology that can then be folded back into fascist ideology, is something that people have to really be careful about. Yeah.
Thank you very much for very stimulating talk. It's so stimulating, so I took a lot of things down in my notes. But the problem is I cannot read my pen.
we could probably open the curtain.
Yes, one thing actually
Go
I
ahead,
can
open the curtain.
So I'm totally agree with you. I mean, especially this botanical imagination in other program works as a motive to reflect on and criticize the disavowal of from the past. But also, I mean, this botanical imagination also can work as can work to justify colonial
Sure.
expansions. For example, shokuminchi
Yeah.
itself. So shoku is planting,
Absolutely.
grafting, very botanical imagination.
Oh, yeah.
Also, this Kominka campaign slogan, Daisenita, is
Yeah.
also is crafting
Yeah,
and so on.
for sure.
So I think it's more like a comment rather than a question.
Right.
So I think maybe we should look at both
Right.
areas
Yeah.
of the possibility of botanical imagination.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely what I is playing with. Right. It's no coincidence. It's not just a random image, right? This idea of the botanical garden where everything is nicely categorized. These botanical tracts. The one that I showed earlier from 1936, right? It's showing the flora of the Bonin Islands, right? I mean, this is a colonial act, right? Look what we own now, right? The very first expedition to the Bonin Islands, I forget exactly the year, but this is during the Edo period, so quite early. A representative was sent there, and what they did was they categorized all the trees, right, all the birds. I mean, this is deeply apart, right? Green imperialism is.
And another data factor is the family tree. And the family tree is another example. Actually, it's rather than transcending the subject and object, it's more like seeing how things branches out and
Right.
then see the hierarchical relationships. And so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I guess I'm going to build off of a couple points raised by Sukbe here. Wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between botany, science, and uprooting empire. I asked this as someone kind of looking at Japanese green imperialism from the Korean Peninsula,
Right.
where you see in August 15th, 1945, Korean people immediately chopping down cherry blossoms that were planted.
Right.
In the decades since, they have systematically tried to literally cleanse the landscape of the material vestiges of the plants that the Japanese introduced during the colonial period.
Sure.
And yet, despite all of this, they are haunted by the ghost of Nakai Takenoshin, a Japanese botanist who in the 1910s classified and named every single plant in Korea, and his name is literally inscribed in the taxonomy,
Right.
the Linnaean classification,
Yeah.
and that's something that they can't shake. They
Right.
can, despite all their efforts to uproot the material aspects of empire, science continues to haunt them because Western scientists to this very day are referencing Nakai and Nakai's
Sure.
work himself. So
Sure.
what is to be said about, I guess if you could say a little bit more about
Yeah.
kind of the power relations embedded in colonial botany.
Mhm.
And also, I guess I'd be curious to hear you think a little bit more broadly beyond the Bonin Islands.
Sure.
One of the real challenges of studying the Japanese empire and its environment is the incredible geographical scope. And so much of thinking and writing about green imperialism requires you to be very sensitive to the particular climatic, soil, botanical conditions in each and every locale.
Right.
So what then can we say systematically about Japanese green imperialism as a whole?
Right. Yeah, that's Well, what we could say as a whole is that it existed, right? I mean, that this was an operative part of the imperial campaign, right? Throughout the years, many different eras in which, right, this expansion took place. There's always this tie to forestry or, in one of the chapters I've written about Osaki Midori, her brother was a researcher, right, about agriculture in the Korean Peninsula. Agriculture, forestry, these things, yeah, they're absolutely tied, but also incredibly specific, right? But it's interesting to think about how there's both that intense specificity, but the idea of imperialism, right, is that it's glossing that over, right? It's making it all one. And so that sort of negotiation is really, difficult, I think. The naming part is, it's fascinating. Now that you say that, Nakai, I'm thinking I recently visited the Koishikawa Botanical Garden at the University of Tokyo. Yeah, it's Nakai everywhere, right? So, or Makino, it's one of the two.
Yeah.
And naming, especially in this story, it's a big deal, right? I think it's important that the Linnaean taxonomy is used in this story, right? For this reason, to kind of show that there is this scientific interpolation, right? That's very different, and is, it carries its own sort of violence to it, right? Within just that sort of taxonomic classification. And of course, we can unfold that back on indigenous peoples as well, right? The ways in which people are named, forced to adopt new names, right? Bonin Islanders, like much of Japan's colonies, had to take on Japanese names. So that's a really important point that you bring up. I don't know if I answered both questions. But I take your point, that this is one small piece, right, is the Bonin Islands with a much, much larger historical concern about the relationship between, Green imperialism in Japan. And it's something to definitely think more about.
I'd love to talk to you. I guess I'm interested in the role of critique in this novel as you're reading it. Clearly, one of the more satisfying and really easy to grasp elements of what you presented was the way that, didn't you say that Haneda Kiyoteru is showing that Ozaki Midori is using plant life as kind of a way to heal and be whole again, whereas Abe Kobo was saying, forget that, that's greenwashing, we're going to talk about the marine. Okay, so that's a critique of colonial violence and even botanical taxonomizing as a part and parcel of that whole enterprise. But so my understanding, one of the cool things about the Liz and Watari is that they're not really satisfied with critique.
Right.
And the whole idea of becoming is that you're not staying in a place of this morality where this is wrong and
Right.
this is right, and the kind of blurring of boundaries is never just about saying how the good and the bad have always been,
Sure.
but of thinking in a new way.
Right.
So in that context, I'm just wondering, to the degree that you're reading all these really interesting people who are attracted to Abe Kobo as one of the most expansive, surely colonial thinkers, but also scientific thinkers in modern Japan, to what degree is that conversation pretty much limned by the necessity of saying, oh, this from Manchuria, the Bonin Island, and making it into a kind of imperial conversation that we already really know how to have? And to what degree is it about something that we haven't imagined yet?
Right.
Ways of because clearly, if animals and plants are capable of movement, nutrition, respiration, and consciousness, it's a long way from there to saying, yes, and they colonize things.
Right. Sure.
So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about critique versus something else.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a great point. the figure of becoming, right, the Deleuze-Guattarian concept of becoming doesn't map perfectly onto this story. Absolutely, right? I mean, they're very clear that it's not a metamorphosis, right? But that the moments in the story where metamorphosis is interrupted, where there are these spaces of in between, right? It's only at the very end that we have a complete metamorphosis. It's locked up, right? That potential for becoming is erased at that moment, right? I think there's potential for something new throughout the story. But what prevents that, right? What comes in and kind of precludes this different way forward is taxonomy, it's all these other things, right? And so, yeah, I think for Abe, he's kind of doing, both at once, if that makes sense, right? He's trying to clearly make an allegorical tale here. Now, the extent to which readers at the time would have had access to some of this information is another question, right? Again, he's using scientific words, right? The history of the Bonin Islands is not the most, discussed, or, it's not really at the forefront at this moment in Japanese history. So it's sort of an obscure way to talk about colonialism. Now again, that may have been strategic. We do have to think, I guess, about, right, censorship and these kind of things. But I also think that sort of allows for a little bit of freedom, right? The fact that he is talking about this allegorical critique, right, that's there, but the stakes of it are a little muddy, perhaps, right? And that allows him to kind of play a little bit towards this becoming, to this something new, right? The other stories that I discuss, Sato Haruo, Tetsuya Asataka, these are hammer nail allegories, right? There's plenty to unpack in both of them, but there's something about, that sort of in-between that's opened up in this story by this engagement with Tamirisef, right? Thinking about animals and plants, right, that sort of resist that allegory, right? Resist critique in a way, but at the end we get to the critique. It almost just wraps it up kind of nicely at the end, but at that point you feel the weight of all of that potential sort of being erased, categorized, locked up. Because I guess how I would think about it.
Yeah, I love your answer. Thank you.
Oh, thank
I
you.
want to talk with you more about it.
Yeah, it's a really fun story to talk about. Any questions, comments? Yes.
Well, you mentioned you discuss film too. I'm interested
Yes.
to know which films you talk about and
Sure.
in your argument.
Yeah, so I have a chapter that looks at forestry and representations of forestry from, well, the film was made in the 80s, so Himatsuri, which is a really, so it was a screenplay written by Nakagami Kenji. Yanagimachi Mitsuo is the director. I believe it won some award at Cannes, was a kind of prestige film. And it depicts a rural village where the forestry industry, is suffering. And you kind of watch the decline of that local economy against the backdrop of these kind of rugged workers who have a very sort of indigenous relationship. There's a lot of comedy sort of play in that story. So I'm sort of following a trope in that chapter from Himatsuri to Kawase Naomi's debut film, which is Moe no Suzaku, which also won a Cannes Prize in the early, 97, I believe, which is sort of a similar tale with, about a local, this is set in Nara, where the community, is suffering from the lack of young people, right? This kind of discourse of declining rural populations. So both of those stories, spoiler alert, end with suicide. a kind of suicide and death. And so there's a real sort of foreclosure of any kind of futurity in those two films, which I then posit against a more recent film with the sort of unfortunate title Wood Job, which is this comedy film made, gosh, maybe 5 years ago now, which is all about the revitalization of Japanese forestry. It's this comedy that was directed by, his name escapes me at the moment. The novel is written by Miura Shion, who's a very interesting contemporary kind of pop writer. But it sort of stages this actually existing campaign that the Japanese Forestry Service has that's trying to lure young people, particularly, students who don't pass college entrance exams, to rural communities to work in the forestry industry. And that there's a real sense of futurity, Japan's future, protecting against climate change. All of this is kind of folded into the revitalization of Japanese forestry. So these films, I'm very interested in what kind of subjectivity there is where there's no imagination for a future, right? Everything is foreclosed. And then, within 20 years, it's completely turned around. And, I just flew here from Tokyo yesterday, and there's so much rhetoric. I mean, even you're on the train and you see all kinds of advertisements about, join forestry jobs. You see it on TV. It's a real kind of cultural moment of that right now. So yeah, that's sort of the film part. Yeah.
I mean, I could take up the rest of our time if need be, but we can save that for lunch. I guess I'm also curious about the extent to which in the stories that you see, plants are functioning as symbolic markers for colonial subjectivity. I mean, there's such rich symbols to begin with.
Yeah.
But in an age in the colonial period, this is the heydays of geographical or environmental determinism.
Right.
When the climate that you inhabit determines your national character, and this colors everything from Nihon Fukeiron and notions of Japaneseness and their relationship with nature. And the flip side of that is that colonial subjects are inhabiting savage lands, and that therefore taints their moral scope and composition. So do you certainly you can talk about this story, but in the text that you've looked at beyond this, to what extent do you see flora sort of functioning as rhetorical devices used to other colonial subjects and imbue them with notions of backwardness and depredation that are also kind of forms of colonial power?
Yeah. The texts that I'm primarily engaging with don't seem to be doing that so much. I suspect that's absolutely a trope, and it could be found in a wealth of literature. A text like this, this is the only direct, this is the only direct reference to any kind of colonial space subjectivity that I look at is in this story. But, I think what's productive about looking at plants in this way is that it makes these texts that are not obviously about colonial modernity clearly about that, right? So something like, Dainana Kantai Hoko, right? Which is about moss and how moss falls in love with other moss, right? You can read this text and have no real, attachment or there's nothing clearly colonial that's marked in the text until you actually look into it and realize, oh, okay, her brother, right, was conducting this research in Korea, wrote about this, right? So this is absolutely drawing from this kind of history as well. It's there. As far as it being a kind of symbol, this is something that I really have to negotiate in my work, right, is this question of how to kind of navigate something being symbolic, being a figure, but also the actual material thing itself, right? Something that I found really helpful for thinking through that is the work of Gregory Bateson. He has this thing called the syllogism in grass, where he argues, I mean, Steps to the Ecology of the Mind is sort of this big classical text, but he has this short speech where he talks about what he calls the syllogism in grass, which he argues that, you know, the biological world functions through metaphor, right? That it's only when we apply classification, right, when we impose names, when we categorize, that things stop functioning through metaphor. It's a difficult, very short, difficult piece.
What does that mean?
His argument is that, so you know, he is arguing against traditional syllogism by saying, men die, grass die, men are grass. Right? And that there's a way in which there's an objective truth to that, right? That if we want to look at the biological world, we have that in common with plants, right? There could certainly be a way in which we could think of ourselves as completely aligned with that. It's only when you actually start having a kind of subjectivity that marks something as plant, as grass, that we start to separate. So, you know, this is one of his late lectures, and gets kind of more experimental as he ages, which is fun if you read his work. But I've just been fascinated by that idea, that whether or not the biological world, how it unfolds, how we understand it, perhaps, you know, most directly is through metaphor, right? That's actually how we engage until we have these kind of regimes of scientific knowledge that tell us otherwise. Is how I understand that. So, yeah. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I completely answered your question.
So my question is about the gender dimension of this botanical rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
For example, as you know, contemporary Japan, maybe it's now out of fashion, but years ago there was an expression that's a otoko and so on, right?
Yeah.
Something like effeminized
Oh, yeah.
women.
Yeah.
So I think it's another way you can see this kind of botanical imagination with the gender dynamics.
Absolutely.
Can a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know, it's funny because I just fairly recently, the past year, Miura Shion, who wrote the novel that became Wood Job, that I was just discussing, she published a novel last year that plays with this very, very much, right? And so it's fascinating because it feels so similar to what Osaki Midori was doing. So in Osaki Midori, right, you have this young girl who moves from the countryside to Tokyo, lives with her brother and siblings in this house, and her brother is the scientist who's playing with moss, right? And so you know, her work has been approached from, you know, feminist critique, you know, feminist perspective, to very, very, you know, productive ends, and it's you know, really, really present there. So Miura Shion's novel, which is Ainaki Sekai, right? So World Without Love, flips it, and so it's a contemporary novel in which there is a man who falls in love with a young researcher at Tokyo University who studies plant cells, and is so engaged with her work that, you know, she resists his advances at all costs, because she finds herself such a part of the world of plants, and the world of plants doesn't have love, so she can't have love, right? And so there's this kind of interesting critique of shokubutsu, you know, so yeah, so that's something I've only recently kind of come upon this novel, but I definitely want to fold that into the work as well. Yeah. Yeah.
So in your materials, you mentioned that whereas a lot of, to the degree that environmental humanities exists in Japanese studies, it tends to be a lot of post-3/11 disaster oriented, and that one of your investments with this project is showing that things that are not obviously ecological can be profitably reread and thought anew that was very convincing. But I wonder how you, speaking of plants and love, how do you go about connecting your project to ecological crisis?
Sure.
And, we just had this big conference on campus over the weekend, Fire and Ice, with all the big journalists talking about sixth grade extinction and what are we going to do.
Yeah.
So, have you had an opportunity to think about how your work relates to the larger project of, whether we call it stewardship, or we just call it survival, or, what is to be done?
Right. Yeah, I like to think, that the work I'm doing is widening the scope, right? There's been so much productive work, growing out of 311, responding to that, imagining futures, and thinking of the past, right? There's been a lot of really great environmental history texts that have been published within the past, 5 to 10 years, right? And so a lot of that has focused on toxicity, right? And it's a very, very important topic, obviously, right? But I'm thinking in this project how, people have been thinking about these questions, outside of that context as well. And so what can happen, like how can we actually add to that conversation by kind of broadening it, right? And so, I sort of position this project outside of that, but it's only outside of it provisionally so that it can ultimately become a part of a much bigger conversation.
And what does that conversation look like when you are in a classroom with undergrads or grads or doing, how do you, I know it's a hard question, but.
Yeah, well, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, but in my experience, students, undergraduate students, are very aware and keen to talk about climate change, about questions of sustainability. I think the kind of lack of response that is happening in this country in particular at the moment is having this kind of ripple effect on the younger generation in perhaps a very productive way. So that, I sometimes am actually finding it easier to talk to some undergraduate students about some of these things than I am colleagues, right? They're more, this is what they know, this is their world, And so Japan becomes an interesting case study for that, right? It becomes a place where they can see that these questions have been around for a long time. There's people who have thought about it, have responded to it, have worked on trying to think what survival might mean, right? And there are people who haven't, right? And so I think, that's my experience, that there actually has been a very, very good response. Students are, I don't want to say excited, that kind of cheapens it, but they understand the gravity of working on this kind of material. And I'll just tell a quick anecdote. So I taught this story to Kakalia a few years ago at UC Berkeley, and this was such a polarizing story. Students who had been engaged throughout the class, who were very much into more direct 311 type work, God bless you 2011, right? These kind of texts. They didn't know what to make of this at all, right? And the students who were really adverse, like just the doom and gloom of radiation and all of this, said, wow, this was a really fun story, right? And so that was actually a very instructive moment for me to think, like, okay, there's a bridge here, right, between different types of students that you can get them thinking about these questions, right, as we sort of expand the text a bit.
So, 5 minutes left if folks have more questions.
Did you have a question earlier? I don't mean to put you on the spot. Okay.
So I have to leave right now, so I'll ask you my question or the rest of it.
Oh, okay, great.
All right, but thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, please join me in thanking Jon PItt.